In the cold twilight of Normandy, the most powerful man in England lay groaning in agony, his belly distended, his breath shallow. King Henry I had defied warlords, outlived his rivals, and ruled with iron calculation. But in the end, it wasn't a sword or betrayal that felled him. It was a plate of lampreys. Greed killed the king, but the horror was only just beginning. To understand the grotesque final moments of Henry I, we must first examine the machinery that made him, the cold, methodical rise of a monarch forged in blood, calculation, and betrayal. Born in 1068, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, Henry Beauclerc was not supposed to rule. His older brothers, Robert Curthose and William Rufus, inherited power while he lingered in their shadows. But Henry understood something they didn't. Patience sharpens power. As William Rufus met a mysterious end in the New Forest, an arrow to the chest under suspicious circumstances, Henry acted with ruthless precision. He rushed to Winchester, secured the royal treasury, and had himself crowned King of England within days. The speed and decisiveness of his ascension shocked the nobility. This was no accident. It was a signal. Henry would not wait to be handed power. He would seize it. He styled himself a reformer, issuing the Charter of Liberties to win favor with barons and clergy. But beneath this polished exterior was a mind like a steel trap. Henry centralized authority, built a bureaucratic system that made him less reliant on baronial goodwill, and curbed the ambitions of nobles who had grown drunk on power since the Norman conquest. He brought order, but it was an order soaked in fear. His private life was just as calculated. He married Matilda of Scotland to unite Norman and Anglo-Saxon bloodlines, a political maneuver cloaked in the robes of romance. Their union produced 2 children, but after Matilda's death, Henry fathered over 20 illegitimate children with multiple mistresses. His court became a web of shifting loyalties and hidden knives. Trust was a currency Henry rarely spent. Yet even the most iron-willed monarch cannot command fate. In 1120, his only legitimate son and heir, William Adelin, drowned in the White Ship disaster, a tragedy that would cast a long shadow over the final decade of Henry's reign. Some claimed it was divine punishment. Others whispered of sabotage. Henry, it is said, never smiled again. With his dynastic future in ruin, Henry's paranoia deepened. He arranged for his daughter Matilda to be recognized as heir, but few in his court supported the idea of a woman on the throne. The seeds of civil war had been planted. Meanwhile, the king clung to control through familiar habits, micromanagement, brutal justice, and an almost pathological obsession with personal discipline. But discipline has its breaking points, and for Henry, it was food. The king had one fatal indulgence: lampreys. These eel-like parasitic fish were considered a delicacy among medieval elites despite their toxic reputation. Henry's physicians repeatedly warned him to avoid them. He ignored them all. Perhaps it was rebellion against the only force he couldn't conquer: time. Perhaps it was habit, hubris, or sheer hunger. Whatever the reason, this craving would soon write the final chapter of his reign. A monarch who had crushed rebellions, outmaneuvered enemies, and built the foundations of England's bureaucratic monarchy was about to be undone not by battle, but by a feast. He thought he could control everything. But what happens when even the most calculating king forgets the limits of his own flesh? It was November 1135, and the air in Normandy had already turned sharp with winter's promise. King Henry I, then 67, was holding court in the town of Lyons-la-Forêt, a favored royal retreat nestled among woodlands. Despite the season, the royal kitchens bustled with the same opulence they had shown for decades. The menu, as always, was dictated not by reason, but by royal appetite. And that appetite had a singular obsession: lampreys. These serpentine jawless fish were considered a delicacy among European nobility, particularly by Henry. He consumed them with ritualistic regularity, often dismissing the warnings of his personal physicians. Lampreys were known to be rich and difficult to digest, sometimes even toxic when poorly prepared. But Henry, ever defiant of mortal constraints, believed his body could withstand anything. He had outlasted brothers, enemies, even time itself. Why would a fish bring him down? That evening, the king ordered a large serving of lampreys stewed in wine, vinegar, and spices, fatty, pungent, and slick with oil. Court chroniclers noted that his physicians pleaded with him to abstain. He waved them off, insulted by their audacity to question him. He was, after all, the master of England and Normandy. What was a lamprey to a king? But soon after the feast, the king began to feel uneasy. At first, he complained of discomfort, assuming it was indigestion. He retired early, but sleep brought no relief. By morning, the discomfort had become full-blown pain, spasms in the gut, sweating, weakness in the limbs. His physicians, now frantic, attempted bloodletting and applied poultices. Nothing worked. Henry's body had begun to betray him. Over the next several days, his condition deteriorated. Witnesses recorded vomiting, delirium, and unrelenting abdominal pain. His once commanding presence shriveled into a pale, trembling figure writhing beneath velvet sheets. Every gasp, every groan echoed through the wooden halls like a judgment. What began as a meal had turned into a slow-motion execution. There was no single diagnosis. Some believed it was food poisoning, botulism, or contamination from spoiled fish. Others whispered of a subtler culprit, the king's own hubris. Henry had been warned again and again, and now, in the twilight of his reign, the body he had once disciplined like a machine was shutting down in revolt. As his suffering dragged on, the political machinery outside his chamber stirred nervously. The barons watched, the clergy prayed. His illegitimate children lingered in the periphery. But the question hung heavy in every corridor. Who would inherit a throne stained with royal bile? On December 1st, 1135, after days of agony, Henry first died. But death was only the beginning. The monarch who had ruled longer than any English king before him now left behind something far worse than a corpse. He left a void, and in that void would grow a war, a power struggle so vicious it would plunge England into chaos for nearly 2 decades. Yet before the anarchy, before the battles and betrayals, there remained one final grotesque task: preparing the king's bloated, decaying body for burial. Because the real horror wasn't just how Henry died, but what had to be done with him afterward. Henry I had ruled with brutal precision, but death refused to grant him the same dignity. In the days following his final breath, his body, already bloated from illness, began to swell grotesquely. The king had died in Normandy, far from Westminster Abbey, where tradition demanded he be buried among English royalty. That meant one thing: his remains had to be transported across the Channel, and that task would become its own horror story. In medieval times, preserving a corpse for long-distance travel was a ghastly process. Embalming, in the modern sense, did not exist. Instead, the body had to be butchered. Henry's internal organs were removed first, his entrails buried hastily in a church near where he died. The rest of his body was then salted, wrapped in animal hides, and sealed in a lead-lined coffin to slow decomposition. But the measures failed. His flesh, weakened by illness and age, began to putrefy faster than expected. By the time the procession reached Rouen, the royal corpse had already become a biohazard. Monks described an unbearable stench that clung to clothing and seeped into the wooden cart. Some accounts claim the body swelled so violently that it burst open. Whether apocryphal or not, the image endured. Those tasked with transporting Henry's remains faced a moral and logistical crisis. Could they allow the English king to rot in French soil, or would they risk unleashing disease by continuing? Ultimately, the need for symbolism outweighed the risk of contagion. The corpse was resealed, and the procession pressed on. No one dared challenge the idea that a king's body must rest in English earth, even if it was half liquefied by the time it arrived. In a strange echo of the king's own governance, every step of the journey was governed by rigid ritual and strategic planning. Clergy walked in silence, barons rode behind in uneasy procession, and townsfolk were kept at a distance, not because of reverence, but to spare them the smell. Eventually, the funeral reached Reading Abbey, Henry's chosen burial site. Founded by the king himself in 1121, it was meant to be a testament to his legacy, a spiritual anchor for the dynasty he tried to build. But as the coffin was lowered into the ground, few could shake the image of the man inside, distorted, bloated, unrecognizable. The final indignity was not the rot. It was the silence that followed. No grand statues were erected in his honor. No epic songs were written. Henry I was buried with ceremony, yes, but without celebration. The man who had centralized royal power, created the exchequer, and forged England's administrative foundation died not in battle or glory, but in gluttony, and left behind a kingdom that would soon unravel. His death was grotesque, but it was the uncertainty afterward that terrified the court most. With no clear male heir and with his daughter Matilda's claim contested by powerful nobles, the fragile political structure Henry had spent decades building began to crack. And so the king's bloated body disappeared into the earth. But his final act would be posthumous. A civil war was coming, one that would paint England in blood. Because when a monarch dies swollen with pride and poisoned by indulgence, the true decay doesn't stay in the coffin. It seeps into the kingdom itself. When the lid finally sealed Henry I's bloated coffin beneath the stone floor of Reading Abbey, England did not breathe a sigh of closure. Instead, the kingdom inhaled deeply, of dread, of uncertainty, of power unclaimed. For all the ruthlessness with which Henry had governed, for all the laws and systems he established, he had failed in the one task that haunts monarchs more than any war or famine, securing a peaceful succession. His only legitimate son, William Adelin, had died 15 years earlier in the White Ship disaster. And though Henry had spent years attempting to place his daughter Matilda on the throne, few took the prospect seriously. A woman had never ruled England in her own right. Powerful barons recoiled at the thought. They had sworn oaths of loyalty to Matilda under pressure, but oaths, in Henry's court, were often more ceremonial than binding. Even before the soil over his grave had settled, the vultures began to circle. Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew and once a loyal courtier, made his move. Claiming that Henry had named him as heir on his deathbed, a lie but a convincing one, Stephen raced across the Channel to England. With the help of his brother, Henry of Blois, the influential Bishop of Winchester, Stephen seized the royal treasury at Winchester and had himself crowned king at Westminster Abbey in December 1135. It was a mirror of Henry's own rapid seizure of power decades earlier. The symmetry was not lost on the barons. The throne was now Stephen's by momentum, not legitimacy. His coronation was hasty, politically aggressive, and rooted more in convenience than conviction. The church endorsed him. The nobles, weary of uncertainty, gave in. Matilda, still in Normandy, was blindsided. But this power grab carried a steep price. Henry's entire reign had been about centralizing power, forcing unity, and suppressing rebellion through fear and efficiency. With Stephen's accession, all of that crumbled. The nobility saw the throne's vulnerability. If one man could break an oath and seize power, so could another. Loyalty became conditional. Alliances began to shift like sand beneath a receding tide. Worse still, Stephen was no Henry. Though personally charming and militarily capable, he lacked the iron resolve and administrative rigor of his uncle. He distributed lands and titles too freely, hoping to buy peace. But peace bought with favors is fragile. Soon, rival claimants rose. Local lords built castles without royal permission. Lawlessness began to seep into the countryside, and then, in 1139, Matilda struck back. Supported by her half-brother Robert of Gloucester and an alliance of barons disillusioned with Stephen, she invaded England to reclaim the crown she believed was rightfully hers. The war that followed, known to history as the Anarchy, was not a single, decisive conflict, but a grinding, years-long struggle of shifting fortunes, betrayals, and unspeakable violence. Towns were razed, churches looted, and peasants slaughtered between factions. Chroniclers wrote that Christ and his saints slept, a damning indictment of the moral and spiritual decay that had overtaken the land. Henry's death had not just left an empty throne, it had unleashed a vacuum so total, so consuming, that it began to swallow the country itself. The crown, once secured by bureaucracy and blood, now floated like a crown of thorns between two hands, neither willing to release their grip, neither able to break the other. And amid this collapse, one question loomed, unanswered and unrelenting. Had Henry's hunger for control doomed the very order he built to protect? Because while Matilda and Stephen battled for the crown, something far older and darker was beginning to reawaken beneath the surface, something festering in the very soul of the realm. As England tore itself apart in the wake of Henry I's death, a strange kind of silence settled across the countryside, not the silence of peace, but of resignation. Between the battles for the crown, there were moments not recorded in royal charters or war reports, but in the fading ink of monastic margins and the oral laments of the common folk. These were the voices that history tried to forget: peasants, clerics, and victims of a war they never asked for. The anarchy, as it came to be known, did not merely pit nobles against one another, it unhinged the very foundation of medieval English life. Castles rose like tumors across the land, built without royal sanction, occupied by lords whose allegiance shifted by the season. They imposed brutal taxes, extorted locals, and kidnapped for ransom. In the words of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, every rich man built his castles, and when they were built, filled them with devils and evil men. Churches became fortresses, markets turned to battlefields, and roads were no longer safe even for messengers bearing holy seals. Commoners, once protected by the crown's authority, found themselves at the mercy of whoever held the nearest blade. Entire villages vanished under fire, their names preserved only in fading land grants, and ghost stories whispered to frightened children. One such voice emerges from the writings of a monk at Peterborough, who described the horrors with barely contained outrage. They put men in prison for their gold and silver and tortured them with pains unspeakable. Some were hung by their thumbs, others by their feet. Some were chained about the head with tight iron collars, until they bled from the mouth and nose. A farmer in Lincolnshire, unnamed but recorded in a local tax document, was found hanged from a tree after refusing to give up his winter grain. His children, it said, starved in the forest. A group of nuns at Shaftesbury Abbey was assaulted when their refuge was seized by a rogue knight claiming loyalty to both Matilda and Stephen, depending on who was winning that week. Even those closest to power suffered. In 1141, the infamous Rout of Winchester led to the burning of the city. Flames consumed not just homes and churches, but the accumulated records of generations. It was as if the war sought to erase the memory of order itself. Yet amidst this wreckage, people endured. In York, a tanner named Aelfric wrote in his ledger a defiant phrase, scribbled between orders for leather goods: "God's justice will outlive theirs." No chronicle recorded his death or survival, but the words endured. Matilda and Stephen's armies moved like waves, each conquest temporary, each loss bitter. No side held the moral high ground. No side brought peace. Instead, the war forged a new kind of suffering, one that lived in the hearts of those caught beneath the weight of royal ambition. The land groaned, not just from the bloodshed, but from the spiritual decay that had crept into the nation's soul. Priests stopped sermons mid-sentence as soldiers raided altars. Holy relics were melted down for coin. Trust dissolved between neighbors. Fear became currency. And through it all, the name of Henry I faded, not with reverence, but with bitterness. His great experiment in centralized power had collapsed into a kingdom where law meant nothing, and loyalty was for sale. But even war has its limits. And as England bled into the earth, one figure, half forgotten, half feared, was preparing to rise from the ruins and lay claim to what she believed was hers by divine right. Because while Stephen played king, and while nobles gorged on the spoils of civil ruin, Empress Matilda had not yet shown the full measure of her wrath. She had been dismissed, undermined, and insulted, but she had never forgotten. Matilda, daughter of Henry I and widow of the Holy Roman Emperor, returned to England not as a queen adorned in gold, but as a thundercloud in human form. The oath that every noble had once sworn to uphold her claim was now a broken promise buried beneath the rubble of civil war. But Matilda had not crossed the sea to ask for her crown. She had come to take it. When she landed in Arundel in 1139, her arrival sent tremors through the already fractured realm. With her came her half-brother Robert of Gloucester, a formidable general, and loyal son of Henry I. Together, they began assembling a coalition of barons, many of whom had grown disillusioned with Stephen's inconsistent rule. Matilda, cold-eyed and calculating, understood that England was no longer a kingdom to be ruled. It was a kingdom to be conquered. Her path was not paved with parades or cheers, but with strategic marches, castle sieges, and whispered negotiations. In 1141, at the Battle of Lincoln, her forces captured Stephen himself. The king, armored in chainmail and ego, was dragged through the mud and thrown into prison. For a moment, it seemed the war was over. Matilda marched on London, the capital that once belonged to her father, and yet as she entered the city's gates, something unraveled. She had won a military victory, but failed to grasp the brittle nature of loyalty in a land saturated with fear and famine. Her manner, imperious, proud, and visibly unyielding, alienated both nobles and clergy. She demanded tribute, refused compromise, and exuded the chill of one who believed herself ordained by divine right. The people, already broken by war, saw not a savior, but another tyrant cloaked in royal lineage. Within days, London rose against her. As the bells tolled and the citizens armed themselves with whatever they could find, Matilda fled in humiliation. Her closest allies retreated. Stephen's wife, Queen Matilda of Boulogne, launched a counteroffensive, and within weeks Stephen was freed in a prisoner exchange. The war tilted again, balance restored, peace postponed. But Matilda did not vanish. She regrouped, recalculated. From fortified strongholds in the West Country, she continued the fight, now entrenching herself as a rival government. Chroniclers on both sides struggled to keep pace with the shifting chaos. There were now two courts, two currencies, two kings, and no order. Yet Matilda's greatest weapon was not her sword, but her memory. She did not forgive. She did not forget. Her campaign was driven by more than ambition. It was an answer to the humiliation of being denied because she was a woman. Every village taken, every castle seized was not just a victory over Stephen, it was vengeance against the nobles who had doubted her bloodline, her resolve, her right. Still, her wrath was double-edged. Many of her own supporters began to fear her inflexible nature. Diplomacy wilted in her presence. Reconciliation was rarely an option. Even Robert of Gloucester grew weary, and when he died in 1147, the soul of Matilda's campaign began to fracture. But from her campaign, brutal, flawed, and incomplete, emerged something new. Her son, Henry Fitz-Empress, had watched every move, learned every lesson. If Matilda had failed to wear the crown, she would mold a son who could crush it into his brow. The Empress had not claimed her throne, but she had built the path that would lead her bloodline to dominate England for generations. And as the land smoldered in civil ruin, a new contender rose in the distance, not as a warlord or opportunist, but as a force forged by legacy, vengeance, and iron discipline. Because while the Empress burned, her son was sharpening the sword of a dynasty. In the cold ashes of Matilda's failed reign, a new figure began to emerge. Not yet a king, not even a man, but a boy shaped by war, exile, and the brutal ambition of his mother. Henry Fitz-Empress, born in 1133, had witnessed the fracturing of his family's legacy before he was old enough to wield a sword. By the time he reached adolescence, he had seen more betrayal than most warriors did in a lifetime. Educated in Normandy and Anjou, Henry grew up on horseback and in the shadows of fallen empires. His father, Geoffrey Plantagenet, Count of Anjou, had ambitions of his own, but it was his mother Matilda's relentless fury, her cold demand that he reclaim what was stolen from her, that carved the boy into something sharper than steel. Where Matilda had been inflexible, Henry was adaptable. Where she inspired fear, he inspired loyalty. By age 14, Henry had already crossed the Channel with a small mercenary force, attempting to claim England. It failed, but failure didn't break him. It taught him. Over the next several years, he moved through courts and battlefields like a phantom, learning not just warfare but statesmanship. He spoke Latin fluently, knew canon law, understood the intricacies of feudal loyalty. He wasn't just preparing to be a king, he was preparing to be a new kind of king. In 1153, the winds of war began to shift. King Stephen, now older and battle-weary, had lost the energy to fight every corner of a crumbling realm. His eldest son Eustace, the heir he had groomed, died suddenly in August of that year, an event many considered divine judgment. With Eustace gone, Stephen's grip on the throne loosened. The kingdom was exhausted. The barons had bled themselves dry. The clergy prayed not for victory, but for an end. Into this climate stepped Henry Fitz-Empress, not with thunder, but with inevitability. Unlike his mother, Henry moved with both sword and smile. He secured key castles through diplomacy. He reminded the barons of their broken promises to his grandfather, Henry I, and above all, he promised stability, an end to the chaos. It was not love for him that brought men to his banner. It was desperation. The Treaty of Winchester was signed in November 1153. In it, Stephen agreed to name Henry as his heir in place of his own surviving son. The document marked the end of the anarchy without a final battle. After nearly 2 decades of civil war, England could exhale. When Stephen died a year later in 1154, Henry Plantagenet ascended the throne as King Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet dynasty, a line that would rule England for over 3 centuries. But this wasn't just a succession. It was a transformation. Henry II brought with him reforms that redefined royal justice, taxation, and administration. The systems first outlined by his grandfather were restored, refined, and expanded. Royal courts replaced baronial ones. A permanent treasury returned. Order clawed its way back into the kingdom. Yet beneath the polished exterior of this new monarch lived the ghosts of the past. His mother's cold fury, his grandfather's hunger for control, the memory of a kingdom that once tore itself apart over a broken oath and a rotting corpse. Henry I had died in gluttony. Matilda had burned with ambition. But Henry II ruled with a clarity that could only be born from the smoke of ruin. Still, even in triumph, one truth lingered beneath the crown. Peace had been bought with silence, with secrets, with blood buried beneath abbey floors and burned villages. And in that silence, something ancient still stirred, because no dynasty rises without debt, and Henry's New England had yet to settle the final cost of its resurrection. For centuries, chroniclers blamed King Henry I's death on a surfeit of lampreys. The phrase became legend, a warning against gluttony, a cautionary tale told in royal courts and whispered in peasant villages. But behind the poetic phrasing lay a real physiological horror that science would only begin to understand long after the king's bloated body was lowered into the ground. Lampreys were more than a culinary curiosity. They were a medieval paradox. Though prized as delicacies, especially by English nobility, they were known even then to cause digestive distress. Lacking jaws and bones, their flesh was oily, rubbery, and rich in compounds that resisted traditional medieval cooking methods. When stewed improperly, lampreys could produce toxins, especially in the gut lining, that modern scholars now associate with foodborne illnesses such as botulism or scombroid poisoning. King Henry's age and weakened constitution likely exacerbated the problem. By 1135, he was in his late 60s, an advanced age for the time. Years of heavy meals, stress, and physical decline had eroded his resilience. Contemporary descriptions of his final days, intense abdominal pain, fever, vomiting, and rapid deterioration, strongly resemble acute gastrointestinal toxicity. While the exact cause will never be medically confirmed, the most accepted modern theory suggests bacterial poisoning from improperly prepared lampreys triggered a systemic collapse. But this wasn't just a tale of spoiled fish. It was a mirror reflecting the broader excesses of medieval royalty. Monarchs were not bound by moderation. Meals were displays of dominance. To feast was to rule. Tables groaned under roasted swan, peacock, boar, and eel. Dishes were layered with exotic spices from the East, not for taste, but to flaunt the reach of royal influence. In that world, excess wasn't indulgence. It was policy. And yet, the very act of overindulgence made kings vulnerable. Medieval medicine had little to offer in the face of toxic shock or organ failure. Physicians often prescribed bloodletting for stomach ailments, a practice that only worsened dehydration and weakness. In Henry's case, records suggest multiple such treatments, which may have hastened his decline. His own court doctors had warned him repeatedly about lampreys. His refusal wasn't ignorance, it was arrogance. This same arrogance was woven through his reign. Henry had structured his kingdom like a machine, tightening control, punishing rebellion, demanding absolute obedience. He trusted bureaucracy more than blood, systems more than sentiment. But the very same precision he wielded in governance failed him at the table. His fatal meal wasn't a random accident. It was the final act of a man who believed himself immune to consequence. In that way, the king's death becomes symbolic. It wasn't just a biological failure, it was a philosophical one. His body, bloated with the same excess that had defined his rule, became a metaphor for a regime that had outgrown its own stability. He had devoured too much: power, land, legacy, and in the end, it turned to poison. Even his funeral was marred by decay. The grotesque decomposition of his corpse during transport spoke to a system unprepared for mortality. The embalming failed, the sealing methods faltered, and the rituals cracked under the pressure of real death. The rot was not just in the flesh, it was in the fabric of his rule. Modern historians continue to debate whether Henry's death was the result of poison, negligence, or natural causes. But the story endures because of what it reveals, not about fish, but about kings. The body of a monarch may wear robes, may issue decrees, may be wrapped in the language of divinity, but it still digests, still decays, still dies. And long after the flesh is gone, the consequences of a single decision, of one ignored warning, can ignite wars, tear apart kingdoms, and stain generations with the scent of arrogance left to fester. Death, when it comes for kings, rarely remains a private affair. Henry III's demise, bloated, foul, and humiliating, wasn't just a medical failure. It became a symbol, a caution, and eventually a stain that no crown could cleanse. For generations, the phrase "surfeit of lampreys" followed his name like a curse carved into the royal record. And while England moved on, through war, restoration, and reform, the psychological wound left by his death remained festering in the cultural memory. It's no coincidence that Henry's legacy was quietly pushed aside in favor of his descendants. He ruled longer than any English monarch before him. He shaped the legal and financial systems that still echo in modern governance, and yet his name is rarely celebrated in stone or song. Why? Because the imagery of his death overshadowed the triumphs of his life. To die of gluttony was not just undignified, it was shameful. It violated the myth of regal control. Monarchs were supposed to pass in glorious battle or surrounded by pious clergy, not in agony after a meal gone wrong. Henry's ending was too grotesque, too common, too human. The psychological impact of that end extended beyond history books. Among the nobility, the idea of overindulgence became subtly linked to weakness. Among the clergy, it reinforced warnings against sin and excess. And among the peasants, it became folklore, tales of a greedy king who died from the inside out, a man whose body rebelled against his ambition. In the centuries that followed, the trope of the overfed, indulgent monarch would reappear again and again. Bloated kings, mad queens, corrupted courts. Henry I became the first great template for the downfall by excess narrative, one that haunted royal houses from France to Russia. It shaped how rulers were remembered and judged, not just by their policies but by their deaths. Even royal funerary customs changed subtly in the wake of his bloated demise. Embalming techniques were improved, coffin design evolved to better contain decomposition, and more importantly, royal physicians gained a stronger voice. Kings began to listen, however reluctantly, to their medical advisors. Because Henry's death wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. It reminded the world that kings could rot. But perhaps the most insidious legacy lay not in science or ceremony, but in the lingering emotional residue. The fear of dying like Henry, helpless, grotesque, stripped of dignity, became a silent anxiety passed down through generations of rulers. It forced monarchs to reckon with their own mortality, their own appetites, their own limits. Even in art and literature, echoes of Henry's fate persisted. He appeared not always by name, but in archetype, the mighty who fall from within, undone by their own consumption. The metaphor proved too powerful to fade, and every time a ruler overreached, every time a government choked on its own greed, the ghost of Henry I stirred beneath the surface. Because the real horror of Henry's death wasn't the fish, the pain, or even the decay. It was the truth it revealed, that beneath the robes, beneath the crown, the king was simply flesh, and flesh, no matter how regal, is never immune to rot. This realization was more than unsettling. It was existential. It confronted both subjects and sovereigns with the limits of power, the illusion of invincibility, and the sobering reminder that no system, no name, no lineage can outpace death when it comes from within. And so long after the lampreys were forgotten, the legacy of that final meal endured, not in records of law, but in the scent memory of a kingdom once ruled by a man who believed he could feast forever. Yet even the stink of death fades. What doesn't fade is the lesson. And as new dynasties rose from Henry's shadow, they carried with them not just his blood, but the silent dread that what happened to him could happen again. History is rarely fair to those it chooses to remember. It isn't always the most just, the most visionary, or even the most tyrannical who leave the deepest scars. It's often those who die strangely. And so Henry I, once called Beauclerk for his sharp mind and scholarly bearing, has been reduced in popular memory not to the man who tamed England's barons or invented the royal treasury, but to the bloated king who died after a plate of lampreys. Yet the grotesque nature of his death tells us more than it mocks. It wasn't just an end, it was a warning. A monarch who spent his life constructing order, who built systems to outlast rebellion and betrayal, was felled not by an army or a dagger, but by his own indulgence. A single act of defiance against medical advice, a private moment of gluttony in a forested hunting lodge, set off a chain of political and spiritual decay that would outlive him for generations. Henry's legacy lies in the contradiction he embodied, a man of astonishing intellect and ruthless governance who nevertheless could not govern himself. He was a king obsessed with structure, yet he died in chaos. He demanded obedience, but ignored it when directed at himself. In that contradiction lies the enduring lesson of his reign. Because the true cost of Henry's death was not personal, it was national. His failure to secure a stable succession plunged England into 2 decades of war, famine, and moral collapse. Castles were burned, towns starved, churches desecrated, and at the root of it all stood a corpse too swollen to bury cleanly, and a throne too fragile to pass without blood. When chroniclers of the 12th century wrote of Henry, they struggled to reconcile the king who restored peace after his brother's wild reign with the man whose body had to be dismembered and salted to prevent it from poisoning the air. Even they, writing in a world steeped in divine punishment and symbolism, seemed to sense that his death was not random. It was retribution. Not from God, perhaps, but from history itself. But was that fair? Perhaps the most horrifying truth is that Henry didn't die uniquely. He died, as all humans do, at the mercy of the body. What made his story extraordinary was how quickly that mortality unraveled everything he had built. His body failed, and with it, so did the political equilibrium of a kingdom. In this way, Henry's death is not just a curiosity. It is a case study in the fragility of power. Even the systems he so carefully crafted, the exchequer, the legal reforms, the ecclesiastical alliances, could not withstand the vacuum left by his departure, because what Henry never accepted was that empires, like bodies, must be prepared for their own decay. Succession planning was not simply naming an heir, it was preparing a culture, a people, a lineage to carry what had been built. Instead, he gambled everything on control, and when he lost, it was not a small fall. It was a collapse. Yet for all the horror of his death, Henry's story isn't only one of failure. He laid the groundwork for the Plantagenet dynasty, a line that would dominate England for centuries. His reforms shaped governance in ways that outlived the anarchy that followed. His daughter Matilda, though never crowned, altered the political possibilities for women. His grandson, Henry II, reimagined royal authority. The bloodline did not die with the lampreys. Still, we must return to the image that lingers. A king surrounded by servants, cloaked in velvet, writhing in pain from a feast he refused to deny himself. A chamber filled with the scent of bile and silence. A kingdom outside, waiting and crumbling. That image remains, not because it is grotesque, but because it is human. And in the end, that may be Henry's greatest legacy, a reminder that all power has limits, and that those who ignore them may build monuments with one hand while digging their own graves with the other. The man who ruled with iron died soft, and England paid the price for his final bite.